Alrighty, cool. Ooh, let me bring that down. So today we're going to go over something a little different. And by a little different, it's not all that different. But we're going to look at Bent Flyvbjerg's Making Social Science Matter. So Bent Flyvbjerg is a Danish economic geographer who is many of his texts deal with this problem around social sciences. And he's interested in how the social sciences can attain some degree. Well, I shouldn't say that. He's not really interested in how they can, but he tries to locate the value of the social sciences. So his primary argument, certainly the one to be found in this text, is that the social sciences shouldn't really try to emulate or replicate the methods and style employed by the natural sciences in order to gain some degree of validity. Which isn't to say that the social sciences are totally invalid now, or everyone considers them as such, but he traces the kind of history of the general subordination of the social sciences to the natural sciences. So that's kind of, to preface up this book a little bit. So he starts out, that was loud, sorry. He starts out by recounting the Alan Sokal affair, where Sokal released or wrote a text called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards the Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Now, I'm sure that most people are familiar with this, but to kind of, reiterate or to make it clear, Sokal thought the social sciences and the humanities were full of garbage academia that wasn't worth paying attention to, and there wasn't any real kind of analytical rigor to their approaches, all in favor of kind of getting rid of the social sciences or those sciences that didn't subscribe to the same methods, Sokal deemed to be the most appropriate. And we can certainly see that happening today. I mean, just recently with those people releasing all those articles to feminist journals in an effort to try and delegitimize, feminist journals as being valid. But what it really should, there are a million opinions on this. In my mind, what it really shows is just how difficult it is to peer review things in great detail. It's difficult to trace down every single piece of data, but, talk about that another time. So Flyvbjerg recounts this experiment, the Sokal experiment, where many people jumped on the bandwagon and were totally prepared to accept Sokal's findings, notably that quantum physics shows to us that there's no such thing as truth, right? Hence the transgressing the boundaries. So the quote-unquote postmodernists loved this, ostensibly, and took it up in ways that Sokal set it up to be taken up as in the form of a trap. And then only afterwards Sokal came out and said, yeah, I made all of this up. So therefore this, should reveal to us that those people that subscribe to kind of postmodern ideas are full of garbage. Now, if anyone is familiar with this, chances are you're familiar with it from YouTube, where there's a video called, or let me double check. Right, it's called the one time that when Alan Sokal completely destroyed postmodernism. And there's a thumbnail with the photo of someone who we're supposed to assume is Alan Sokal, or Sokal, I don't know how to pronounce it right. But it's actually a photo of Bruno Latour, hence my Freudian slip a few moments ago. And it's shocking, the people claiming to have this, being able to tap into some kind of transcendental empiricism or kind of truthfulness, can't even get their characters right, but I guess that's neither here nor there. A petty criticism, I suppose. And to this whole Sokal thing, Derrida had this nice comment on it. He was like, yeah, I don't know how seriously we're supposed to take a scientist, that is Sokal, who only got famous by producing a fake study, which I thought was and that's not verbatim, but it kind of sounds like that, which I thought was a pretty funny approach. So Flyvbjerg he takes this moment as being like a possible learning experience, where he doesn't want the question around the social sciences to be how can they become valid in the same way that the natural sciences are, at least supposedly. He says that in fact, the social sciences have a certain obligation to not adopt those very same methodological approaches indicative of the natural sciences. So what might those look like? Well, for Flyvbjerg, he suggests that indicative of the natural sciences is this idea of the episteme, or kind of epistemic knowledge. So this is a kind of a tricky idea because I think Flyvbjerg is a little bit selective in how he understands this term. So he's taken this term out of Aristotle, and it applies to that idea of knowledge, or just belongs to the domain of knowledge more generally. Now, for Flyvbjerg, epistemic knowledge is kind of a priori arrived universal knowledge. So coming out of Aristotle, Flyvbjerg considers, as I said, the episteme to be like the kind of universal set of beliefs pertaining to any given kind of knowledge base, or the production of knowledge as such. And he uses Foucault quite a bit in this book. Foucault's idea about the episteme is a little bit different. So I want to read a passage from the Archaeology of Knowledge, where he says this: "The episteme is not a motionless figure that appeared one day with the mission of effacing all that preceded it. It is a constantly moving set of articulations, shifts, and coincidences that are established only to give rise to others. As a set of relations between sciences, epistemological figures, positivities, and discursive practices, the episteme makes it possible to grasp the set of constraints and limitations which, at a given moment, are imposed on discourse. But this limitation is not the negative limitation that opposes knowledge to ignorance, reasoning to imagination, armed experience to fidelity to appearances, and so on." So when we're working with Flyvbjerg's term here, it's a little bit difficult to accept, but in order to kind of get through the book, we have to accept that episteme is a more stagnant, more of a fixed concept pertaining to the Socratic method, or kind of Socratic reasoning that has supposedly taken on something of a universal aura. Now, the episteme and technical knowledge, or techne, are two things that come out of Aristotle. And Flyvbjerg kind of traces this right out of the gates with his book, and says that for the most part, Western civilization has been guided by these two, right? Where techne applies to like craft, the ability to actually produce something physical in the world, and epistemic knowledge being able to supposedly produce and reproduce ideas or experiences or whatever in, proper Socratic fashion. Where for Flyvbjerg, these ideas really come out in Aristotle, in Aristotle's Ethics mostly, where there is a third concept as well, one that has been widely ignored. So he sets up what Aristotle calls phronesis. So phronesis is that domain of knowledge that is true state and reasoned, and capable of action with regards to things that are good or bad for man. That's out of Aristotle. So this whole question, indicative of the Sokal affair, kind of the Sokal experiment, was that in order for a science to be considered legitimate, it has to contribute to the domain of epistemic knowledge, as opposed to phronetic knowledge or phronetic values. Because while epistemic knowledge might be able to reproduce conditions, might be able to reproduce results, giving it some degree of validity in that domain, epistemic knowledge cannot actually give us a sense of value or tell us why such results are valuable, whereas phonetic knowledge can supposedly do that. So this book is an attempt for Flyvbjerg to think through the possibility that the social sciences can take on fully this kind of phonetic character, rather than trying to emulate and become part of that epistemic field. So he gives us an example of a study done with paramedics. So there are these paramedics that were essentially made to be test subjects. Well, made to be. Paramedics were part of a research study where they were shown videos of other paramedics performing various, life resuscitating maneuvers or movements or skills or whatever, paramedic stuff. And what they came to find was that of the test subjects that were the active paramedics, almost 90% of them could choose who were the most effective or who were the most experienced paramedics that they were presented with. With the paramedic instructors, on the other hand, only 30% could actually choose the most experienced paramedics. So Flyvbjerg takes this to mean that experience and practical knowledge are very important for, arriving at certain value judgments and conclusions that a priori, or kind of reason knowledge, intellectual knowledge, epistemic knowledge, as Flyvbjerg understands it, doesn't give us that kind of understanding of the world. So he uses this example to kind of, get into this, the muddy territory of justifying why value-oriented research or research that deals with context or people is very important. So upon considering this paramedic study, he moves into the work of someone by the name of Dreyfus, who kind of laid out suggested that there were 5 levels of learning. So for him, the first 3 levels correspond to almost what he calls rule-based thinking or learning, where all you are doing from the first to the 3rd levels is understanding the systems that you are working with and trying to, over the course of that time, minimize the amount of intellectual effort you need to put in order to be an effective agent within that field. Now, he gives the example of 2 chess players, more specifically, a human chess player versus a computer chess player. Now, what he says is that a computer chess player will always belong to the domain of the first 3 levels of learning, because all they know is how to follow algorithms to the T. The 4th and 5th layers are responsible for a sort of spontaneity, intuition, and an ability to adapt to context that is not given to those that are stuck within the first 3 layers. So the 4th and 5th layers then contribute to the process of creating knowledge in that field, right? Because it allows for certain intensities or kind of, intensities in the form of like new possibilities to come into fruition. Because it is after internalizing the rules in the first 3 layers that new things can occur, where creation happens. So these first 3 layers are totally rational for Flyvbjerg. They are given a formula and they follow it. In the first and 2nd layers, they probably drudge along trying to get through all the rules and understand them. But in the 3rd layer, at the kind of high end of a rule-based understanding, all you have is the internalization of the system. You don't go any further than that. There's no spontaneity, there's no intuition, there's no kind of calculation beyond the rules that are set forth, and you were kind of made to be a robot in that way. So he says that and this is especially pertinent in thinking the distinction between the computer chess player and the human chess player. Humans are much more complex, and they can very rarely be reduced to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd components, or the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd layers. If a human's learning a particular skill, absolutely, they have to go through these processes. Learning to play an instrument demands the grappling of various technical elements before being able to create your own stuff that can, there are exceptions, obviously, but, this is what we have. Where humans belong to what he calls a kind of irrational space, one that is full of intensities and full of kind of unexplainable, spontaneous acts. So in that way, it kind of belongs to the 4th and 5th layers. So he uses this to kind of emphasize that humans can't really be understood in terms of rational, rule-based, epistemic approaches to knowledge, but must be understood in context and intuitive ways that account for these variations, that account for these kinds of discrepancies across time and space. So this general approach is opposed to a kind of Socratic method. So Flyvbjerg gives the example of a few Socratic dialogues, one with Meno, for instance, where he's trying to talk about the universality of virtue, and whenever he gives Meno a question or a proposition, Meno always responds with particulars, responds with just individual kind of spontaneous instances to try and encapsulate this whole domain, to which of course Socrates is not satisfied in his searching for these kind of universal truths or whatever, and therefore they never get anywhere. So it is in that way that Flyvbjerg really is taking from Nietzsche, especially because we think of Nietzsche in like the Birth of Tragedy, where he's taking on the kind of Apollonian character of Socrates in favor of kind of Dionysian, illogical, quote unquote, method that accounts for variations, that accounts for, in part, just how, things don't always subscribe to a rational order. So this opens up the possibility for Flyvbjerg to theorize this thing that he takes from Kuhn. That is a hermeneutic phenomenology, or hermeneutic phenomenological approach. Now what he means by that, if we take these two terms separately, hermeneutic, that is a study, or kind of like a close reading, and typically that applies to the Bible. So you do like a hermeneutic of the Bible, or close reading or evaluation of certain texts or certain passages or whatever. And then phenomenology is difficult to define, to say the least. It has a pretty expansive history. Phenomenology, in very basic terms, corresponds to that domain of philosophy that is interested in the realm of appearances. Now that's one approach, where some other approaches, and I guess for the most part I'm more versed in feminist phenomenology, which is very much interested in embodiment, where there is a direct connection between the world and the bodies that exist within it, where the two shape one another, right? And in order for people to be, engaged in the world, they have to have the ability to be embodied by the world, and there are millions of arguments about that, and this isn't like the definitive definition, but I take that one to expound upon what Flyvbjerg means here. Because when he talks about a hermeneutic phenomenology, he's suggesting that the researcher or the study of any given societal framework, any kind of cultural setup, will have effects on the researcher as well. Or, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, we can consider this another way, where all people are determined by their kind of social setup. Now, this hermeneutic phenomenology then would account for these variations and allow people who are studying this to understand that there is no single possible interpretation of the way that things are operating, right? So it dissuades the possibility of, simplifying the world under under a few kind of axiomatic presuppositions, whether they've been arrived at a priori or what have you. So for this very reason, Flyvbjerg doesn't see it really possible for the social sciences to adopt any kind of epistemic approach, one indicative of the natural sciences, because there's no way that results could be reproduced, one of the staples of quote-unquote valid research. They couldn't be reproduced, they couldn't be, explained in any sort of kind of rational way. Rather, these things are always susceptible to the winds of change. So in considering or putting into consideration context and how things change across time and space, he brings up Bourdieu. So Bourdieu's being that person that thinks about like practical philosophy or philosophical field work, whatever that might look like. And he gives us kind of a history here. So moving from that for just a moment, he says that there are 6 layers to the development of a kind of natural science approach, an epistemic one, where the first 3 layers correspond to kind of a Socratic method, and they are as follows. Number 1, explicit, or knowledge has to be explicit or clear. Number 2, universal, pretty self-explanatory. 3, abstract, that is no reference to real examples, like how Socrates chastised Meno for doing that. Now, number 4 and 5 here, we move from Socrates as our central figure into the domain of the moderns, early philosophy, like kind of core philosophy with Descartes and Kant, where number 4, corresponding to Descartes, who supposes that knowledge must be discrete, that is always context independent. Then number 5 with Kant, it has to be systematic. So we can think of the a priori here, or, through reason arriving at some kind of, logical whatever. And then number 6, which is indicative of science, we arrive at a complete and predictive model where we can forecast things supposedly accurately, we can reproduce conditions, and that is what determines what is valid. So he's giving us kind of a history here. It's, it's limited, but how we, I don't know how we would have done it otherwise. But here we have it. So the social sciences shouldn't try to adopt that, even though there are attempts, certainly today in the social sciences, to have a degree of validity, right? By being able to, claim that there are true biological differences between like men and women or across races or stuff like that, as though these things don't change and they aren't negotiated through the way that people present themselves. So instead of that, the social sciences should be more in tune to what Flyvbjerg takes from Bourdieu. They should be more attuned to what he calls second-degree explanations, where no possible real definitive explanation can be given, because that would be absurd, but rather we only approach things kind of marginally, so that we can always claim a degree of separation from these axiomatic broad claims. So after kind of saying all this, Flyvbjerg also says that this isn't about undermining the natural sciences. He says that they have a very valid, their own approach is valid as well. What he is challenging is the subordination of one to the other, is the suggestion that one is more valid than the other. That is something that he wants to oppose, and that's what he's trying to get at, because he sees that for the most part, the natural sciences look down upon the social sciences, right? Consider the social sciences to be kind of a gong show of research without any real outcomes. So now we move into the second part of the book, where he starts to consider how phronesis can be realized to some extent. So he brings up Aristotle once more and says, and locates in Aristotle 3 attributes of phronetic research or phronesis, and they are as follows. Number 1, it should ask, where are we going? Number 2, is it desirable? And number 3, what should be done? So embedded within these questions are various connotations pertaining to the fluidity of kind of social dynamics, right? Suggesting that things can change, suggesting that things can be negotiated and how they change, and that, perhaps it's unclear as to what they'll actually change into. But rather, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. In fact, this is very legitimate research, especially because it affects so many people. But even this approach, the Aristotelian one, although it serves as a kind of point of departure for Flyvbjerg's own project, it is limited. And he does digress before he gets into this some more, but what he essentially suggests is that while this is all well and good, we need to also have a consideration of power within this framework, where we consider the ways in which even frenetic research, even attempts to kind of move the social body in some way, can be in the favor of maintaining relations of power that otherwise we could very well challenge if we kept these things in mind. So he's going to work towards how we could consider power in relation to phronesis in order to be more, to have a better system, a more egalitarian type approach to it. Before doing this, however, he takes kind of a detour into one domain of social science research that is, or even in the natural sciences, I guess this is done, but a domain of research that is often considered to be invalid. And that is the case study. So for Flyvbjerg, he says that the case study is rich with possible information, with possible conclusions to be derived from it, because for him, the general public, and this is a kind of an odd thing for him to say, isn't all that exciting for him. So the case study gives, for him, what he says, a nuanced view of reality, where he thinks that, for the most part, the general public could be very easily persuaded, right, in a kind of groupthink type way. So if surveys are conducted, and this is how they're often conducted, there are various axioms that guide them. They have to be blind, they have to be random, all of this. Flyvbjerg says, okay, well, you may just be affirming the very existence of some kind of societal prejudices that aren't natural, nor are they universal, but because you take these axioms to be indicators of validity, that is randomness or blind, then you come to affirm those very results that you wanted to get, right? So if you were to send out, for instance, a survey asking, are men better than women? Ridiculous thing. Chances are, who knows, actually. But if you were to get the results back that, yes, it says men are better than women, and then people come out and say definitively, looked, we've checked all the boxes, we performed a blind random sample, we performed this study on a blind random sample, or we did this blind or whatever, therefore we have, the facts. Whereas, Flyvbjerg kind of holds on to that old dictum. I forget who said it, but it goes like, there are small lies, there are big lies, and then there are statistics. And there's a lot of truth to that, especially in relation to Flyvbjerg here. So the case study can give us a peek into something that might otherwise go unnoticed. And it's not even as though the case study should be done to arrive at a kind of general narrative of, the community or group or society, but that even if they're taken as an individual instance, they can have a value in their own right. So it would be antithetical for Flyvbjerg to suggest that, yeah, case studies are great if we did 1,000 of them in a community of 1,000 people. Because Flyvbjerg would then be like, well, you're just doing the same thing. So he wants to locate a kind of value in the individual cases or in the particulars that are wholly enmeshed within a kind of cultural framework that you can get at the crux of through that individual instance or person. So in routing his argument back from this kind of detour through case studies, he considers power. And he considers public spheres to some extent. So this section deals with Habermas and Foucault. So Habermas still alive, I think, unless he died in the past few days. Habermas is, a thinker about public spheres that I can't stand, but, I'll try to present him not biased. And then we have Foucault. So Flyvbjerg recognizes in Habermas that he has a strong affinity with the kind of epistemic tradition as we understand it through Flyvbjerg. He's very much indebted to Kant, Hegel, not to say that Foucault isn't, but in the way he's indebted to them because of their attempts to arrive at kind of universalistic conclusions about people, right? So what Habermas essentially says is that in order to have a proper kind of liberal democratic society, we have to establish zones where people can get together and talk, and through reason, not force, people can then decide what is best for the community. So a number of problems with that right off the bat. How do you account for varying power relations? If you have a group primarily of white males, are they going to just speak more than other people, other minorities? I would tend to think yes. It's how I experience most of my time, or it's how I experience it most of my days. To which Habermas pretty much says, yeah, well, in order to curb that, in order to account for that, we're just going to check our privilege at the door, and then we'll come in as blank slates. To which people have very adequately, people like Nancy Fraser, have been very reticent to assume that any such thing could occur, right? How do you just check your privilege at the door and then, go in? And how do we know that any kind of reason that we arrive at is actually going to be best for the community, or if it'll just be best for a certain group of people? And not even, we should also mention that Habermas kind of frames this idea of the public sphere around the bourgeois model. Like everything about it is wrong. It's shocking, really. I don't know how Adorno wasn't like, dude, what's wrong with you? But maybe he was. I don't know what their relationship was like, but yeah. Someone can rip me apart for my poor understanding, I'm sure. So in opposition to Habermas, Flyvbjerg brings us Foucault and says that Foucault gives us the antidote to the Habermasian model, because Flyvbjerg says, sure, that'd be a really great idea. Maybe there is a way to foster something like that, but we can't lose sight of the fact that there are relations of power that are essentially, that work on the people inside of it. So it's for that reason he's like, he kind of looks back on Habermas and says, okay, let's move into something better now. So moving into Foucault, he recognizes that Foucault is also indebted to many of the same thinkers. Like, Foucault is often referred to as, being part of that quote-unquote postmodern group, a term that makes me want to rip my hair out, as just like a neo-Kantian, which... And this is certainly indicative of Habermas himself, who pretty much disregarded Foucault, said Foucault was just a kind of relative nihilist, didn't care about anything, and that he shouldn't be taken seriously. So to this, Flyvbjerg says, okay, sure, there is the possibility that thinkers like Foucault could be read as relativistic, but he says, actually, maybe we could think of this another way. We could think of this as being in tune with context variations in context, where rather than being relativistic, Foucault's work is certainly context dependent, which, it's pretty much just saying relativistic, but not quite as jarringly, of course. But Flyvbjerg ultimately sees the value in that because he considers Nietzsche to be a kind of Nietzschean democrat, someone who doesn't ever, is never really satisfied with any given proposition, right? Or any kind of given antidote or kind of societal structure that'll fix everything in the form of a kind of utopian ideal, but rather wants to, continue the process of critique, right? He wants to keep things, at bay through their perpetual analysis, through their perpetual critique. Now, having, established the distinction between Habermas and Foucault, which I don't know if it was totally necessary. I feel like he could have just jumped right into Foucault. He now moves into just Foucault. So he takes a quote out of Foucault. I don't know where Foucault actually says this, so Flyvbjerg just quotes it. But according to Foucault, philosophy began with Aristotle, which is that's a funny sentence. I like that a lot. I guess, Foucault didn't care much for the kind of Socratic or Platonic means of thinking. I can't think of where he would have taken it on. I haven't read many of his lectures. Like I've read all of his books, but not the lectures, not all of them at least, and some of his essays. Maybe he has a thing about Socrates in the way that Derrida has in on his Plato's Pharmakon thing, or the Pharmakon. But I think that's why, because Aristotle was certainly more in tune with context, certainly more in tune with the world around him than Plato or Socrates were, who relied on epistemic knowledge. Again, epistemic as we understand it through Flyvbjerg. But with that being said, Flyvbjerg even sees in Foucault various changes across his line of thinking, where he says that the early Foucault was actually much more geared towards a kind of epistemic approach, wanting to think of a way for social sciences to have a kind of epistemic character in books like The Order of Things, and how that comes to change with especially moving into history of sexuality and like Discipline and Punish. But Foucault has this nice line in The Archaeology of Knowledge, where he says that, generally speaking, madness and civilization accorded far too great a place, and a very enigmatic one too, to what I called an experiment, thus showing to what extent one was still close to admitting an anonymous and general subject of history. So this is, this quote isn't in Flyvbjerg, I just happen to recall it. This shows, like, to some extent that even Foucault was aware of this, how he was a part of that epistemic, knowledge base, or that desire to get at that in his much earlier work. And how, by the archaeology of knowledge, he's certainly starting to reconsider that. For Flyvbjerg, however, he's interested in books like The History of Sexuality because they take at their base, without having, establishing a very clear methodological approach, even though he does have that kind of section, those 4 sections kind of laying it out. What interests Flyvbjerg is that Foucault is very clear that he's just speaking about a particular cultural moment here, and he's looking at various instances throughout that kind of cultural moment. The same with Discipline and Punished, and to some extent I would certainly say the same for Madness and Civilization. But, here we have it. So Foucault, as Flyvbjerg very correctly identifies, is a Nietzschean. Foucault is, Nietzsche embodied in, the mid-20th century. I hope no one sends me death threats for saying that. So it's in that way that Foucault isn't so much influenced, at least according to Flyvbjerg, by Aristotle, but he's influenced by Nietzsche, who was influenced by Aristotle, again, according to Flyvbjerg. So here we are given, or he takes from Foucault 4 maxims that come out of, and look at the kind of, I didn't plan this, but the last one I did, video here I did, was on The History of Sexuality, the second half of it, where he talks about this. So Flyvbjerg takes from Foucault 4 general propositions, and they are that power relations are intertwined with other relations. Number 2, power comes from below. Number 3, it cannot be contained. Number 4, where there is power, there is resistance. So the general thing that Flyvbjerg takes from that is that power works in the form of like a network, or like a spider web, as some people might come to understand it. Or it exists at the granular or capillary level, where there is not a single locus of power, but rather it works in terms of relations, and it works in terms of networks. So because power works in terms of networks, and because people pretty much work the exact same way, Flyvbjerg says that there's a lot we can get out of Foucault in considering the way that we cannot necessarily just speak truth to power, right? We cannot just speak truth to a system that might be oppressive, because that system may very well have determined the conditions of knowledge, the conditions of power. And certainly we can see that today with much of the rhetoric going around about freedom of speech, where freedom of speech, put a little footnote after speech and have the caveat like freedom of speech is what we tell you it can be, and freedom of speech is yada yada yada. Freedom of speech is reserved for people who want to spout racist shit and all that, at least against marginalized folks. Freedom of speech stops when you have black people or Black Lives Matter in the street. Then suddenly they're a mob, and suddenly, yeah. So there are restrictions placed on it. So we can see, even with that example, that there is no possible production of knowledge, if we take Foucault seriously, that is not governed by some form of power. So even in the kind of the moment where research is conducted, we see existing in that moment there being a researcher and a researched. We see established in that moment power relations in almost a hauntingly literal form, where you have one people studying another group, saying, you are going to be the ones that you are just, going to be the ones that we study like some kind of lab rats. So it's in that way, and I get a little suspicious when he says this, but he says that frenetic research, no one should claim authority in frenetic research. And while it might be good to always resist that, the claiming of authority, I don't know if it's fully possible, but he gives us that. That's what he suggests, at least. So then he returns to those Aristotelian, concepts pertaining to phronesis, or those 3 questions. And they are, I will reiterate as follows. You have, where are we going? Number 2, is it desirable? Number 3, what should be done? So Flyvbjerg says, in considering Foucault, what we're going to do is reconsider that. So we're going to add one, and this one goes as follows. Who gains and who loses by what mechanisms of power? So this is what gives him kind of a model for the realization of frenetic research, because it considers how power may influence and alter even those societal formations that are being studied, or groups or people that are being studied, and takes that into consideration. And especially because frenetic research is not something that is just studying something for the sake of studying it, but is actually interested in kind of allowing for things to develop and change. It will make it so that whatever it develops into, at least in a very ideal sense, is something that is better for people. So then he gives an example of his own experiences with what was called the Aalborg Project, which was an attempt to make Aalborg more appealing for for all commuters, I guess, from private transport to public to pedestrians, everything like that. And, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but he recounts this experience because no matter how much kind of real data and kind of reasonable and logical evidence he provided to the city council about how it's beneficial to create, work the city to be in favor of public transit and, pedestrians and cyclists, because the city is not sustainable if everyone has to get cars. He says that the city council was always opposed to that, saying like, no, you're wrong, like it doesn't matter, which really illuminated the fact for him that you can't really speak truth to power, right? It doesn't matter how much rationality you're coming to the table with, you are not going to be able to get at. Power is always going to outweigh you to some extent. And he says that it was only after, much effort that he was actually able to get to the table with them and, actually engage in dialogue, at which point things could actually get better. And he takes this as a possibility, and he says that, it's really important to foster kind of dialogue, right, in a kind of Habermasian way, in order to allow for meaningful things to develop. So he says in that capacity, he appreciates dialogue over polemics. And it's a little bit idealistic. I mean, I think there are times when dialogue fails and you have to take on dialogue through other means, right? Sometimes it's good not to play nice. Like, I don't think it should always be about respecting the other person, especially if they're, trying to tout some authoritative type garbage. But yeah, and he kind of, to conclude his book, just considers the importance of that and how the social sciences should try to emulate that approach by allowing for open dialogue between researchers and those people being researched, rendering them not objects of study, but subjects of study. People who can give back and contribute, and they can, researchers can go into certain areas and, be a part of that community. Now, there are also a number of other problems with that, especially in, the North American context, where in the case of many Aboriginal communities or nations, there are groups that do not allow white settler researchers to just go in and start studying them, no matter how kind of benevolent they consider themselves to be, no matter how frenetically driven they consider themselves to be. So it's in that way that Flyvbjerg gives us a pretty ideal vision here. And it's one that, we should take to task and take with a grain of salt a little bit. But it is a nice image. And one of the nice things about him is that this is a really approachable book. There are you could take some central claims to task a little bit. Some of his, terms are used a little loosely, but he's a really good writer. Like, he writes very methodically and it's very clear, especially dealing with the subject matter. It's an impressive task to be able to do that. So I guess on that note, I don't see any reason to keep it going here. I definitely recommend people check it out because it's really relevant today with, people running around saying that, women's studies departments shouldn't exist and all that type of stuff. But on that note, if you made it this far, cool. And if you have a problem with what I did, you know how to leave it, and you have the dislike button, do whatever you want. I don't give a shit. But